Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. This is a training that's being provided by NASCSP as part of the Weatherization Plus Health Initiative. This afternoon's webinar, a crash course on the introduction to WAP, will be presented by Bob Scott, the Director of Energy Services at NASCSP, and Kelly Cutchin. Kelly is the WAP Technical Assistant at SMS Consulting. Before we begin, I'd just like to share some information on the format of this webinar. All of the attendees are on mute, and you will be given the capability to ask questions. If you do have a question, we ask that you would use the chat feature of the webinar and send your questions to the organizer. Once your questions come in, we will ask the presenters your questions, and if we run out of time, your questions will be answered in a follow-up email. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and now I'm going to turn things over to Bob and Kelly.
Thanks, Raymond. And thank you to the participants on the phone and on the webinar. We're going to try to consolidate 35 years of weatherization program evolution and a pretty complex program into a 90-minute presentation. So let me say that if there are questions, please feel free to contact us, and we'll try to clarify or fill in the blanks as we go as much as possible. This slideshow is a brief overview of what we will cover today, giving you some of the basics about the Weatherization Assistance Program and how it has evolved, and touching on the services delivery network, how the program's funded, the people it serves, and the process, the program results, and some of the resources for finding out more about this program. Then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Kelly Cutchin, who's going to give a brief overview of the technology basics of the program, including the whole house as a system approach, some of the testing diagnostics, how the home is audited, and some of the measures that are typically installed on the home. The mission of the Weatherization program is fairly simple. It targets the most vulnerable families, notes the primary goal of reducing the energy costs, and also notes the health and safety of the families. The Weatherization program was founded during the 1970s, during the days of the Arab oil embargo, when there was so much news about increasing and volatile home heating oil and gasoline prices. If you were around in those days, you remember the gasoline lines and how prices just went to unheard of levels for that time. Congress acknowledged the extreme impact and burden that the rapidly increasing prices had on low-income families and created the Weatherization Assistance Program largely in recognition that so much of America's housing stock, particularly that inhabited by low-income families, was very energy inefficient, and that relatively simple improvements such as reducing air infiltration and adding insulation could help both those families and be a wise investment in the country's housing stock. So in recognition that there were very different climatic conditions in various regions of the country, the states and local agencies work to determine best practices and the most cost-effective measures for their housing stock and climate within fairly broad-based DOE regulations. That technology has continued to evolve over the years, and with developing computerized energy audits, high-tech diagnostic testing procedures, and state-of-the-art installation techniques that have become the basis and framework for a growing home performance residential energy efficiency industry. The Weatherization program now operates in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, 6 U.S. territories, and 2 Native American tribes. Weatherization focuses on low-income families who often have dire situations of having to choose between paying heating bills and other necessities. Weatherization so far has, in its history, weatherized about 7.4 million homes, but there's still about 30 million more that are eligible for the program. And a very large number of those are very inefficient structures that place placing both high energy costs and a high energy burden on those residents. So weatherization, we'll look at some of those results in a bit, but for now, let's just go with that. The energy efficiency measures done reduce the energy costs for many years to come, and they help protect the residents against volatile price increases. And the last bullet there talks about arrearages, and from a utility perspective, weatherization program can help alleviate bill arrearages and reduce service cutoffs and reconnections, which can make it an attractive partner for utility projects, which I will mention again in a few minutes. So looking a little bit about energy burden, let me give a simple definition of energy burden as it pertains in this case. Energy burden is the ratio of home energy costs in proportion to the household income. For example, if the household income was, say, $10,000, I'm going to use round numbers, it was $10,000, and the energy bills to that household were $2,000 a year, then the energy burden would be 20%. Low-income households have a much higher energy burden than middle-class or wealthier households. The burden can be so high that sometimes these families simply can't afford to pay their bills, or they have to choose between heat and other necessities that come up. And this is even compounded by the fact that low-income families often live in substandard housing that is often the most energy inefficient housing out there, and therefore have the highest fuel bills. So the people least able to afford the bills in the first place also have the highest bills. So weatherization has those benefits of alleviating that energy burden and those high prices, and a couple other benefits which, again, I will mention some more of later, but some of the common ones we talk about are the jobs that are produced in the program, local, non-outsourced jobs, technical training, reduced dependence on foreign oil, and reducing carbon emissions. Back to the energy burden a little bit. When I looked at who was registered for the conference, I saw several people from California, so I am using that as an example. The energy burden, I said, was about 15% on an average for low-income Americans, but the lowest of the low income is much more drastic. So in California, for instance, the very poorest of the poor, those below 50% of the poverty level, have a very high energy burden, like over half their income goes towards energy bills, assuming those bills are paid, of course. But their energy bills total more than half of their income. And there's 718,000 homes that have that unique problem. So it's huge. And then the next income bracket, 50 to 74%, their energy burden goes down to 21%, which is still a high energy burden. That's another 400,000 families, and so on. And this information that is on this slide is available at that website that's posted, homeenergyaffordabilitygap.com. It notes that energy burden in this format and some additional information as well for all the states, all 50 states. It's updated annually as well. This is 2012 data for 2011, and there should be updated data in June of 2013 that will have the 2012 statistics. So going over to weatherization, who is served? The eligibility of the program is based on 200% of the federal poverty levels. That income was changed during the Recovery Act, but it was a statutory change that did not go back after the Recovery Act. So at this point, it is still 200% of the federal poverty level. The elderly, people with disabilities, families with children, high-end users, which is high bill and high energy burden, which I described previously, those customers are given priority in the program. As far as the housing stock, weatherization serves all types of housing stock, mainly single-family, mobile homes, and multifamily. Each type has its own unique issues and challenges for the weatherization provider, and best practices for the diagnostic testing and installed measures have constantly evolved for each type. I should also mention that the homes can be owner-occupied or rental units. We serve both. The housing stock of low-income people is often substandard housing. We often see these structural problems, sometimes rotted-out floors, rotted-out walls, bad roofs, wiring and plumbing problems, and often poorly maintained homes just because the people cannot afford to do proper maintenance. Heating systems in particular are something that is of great concern to us, because when we tighten the house, if the heating system isn't operating safely, it can sometimes exacerbate the situation. So we often come across heating systems that haven't been maintained. They are unsafe and can be dangerous, including high levels of carbon monoxide. The way the weatherization program funding works is this. The Department of Energy is the main source of funding. It provides what we call the core funding, the base funding of the program, and that money goes to those grantees, the states and the territories, D.C. and the 2 Native American tribes. Many states also receive LIHEAP funding. Typically, people think of LIHEAP funds in terms of helping low income with their fuel bills, but they also have provisions that they can transfer some of their funds to weatherization programs for the energy efficiency measures. And currently about, I think, rough number here, not an exact number, low 40s of states, 40 some states, 42 or so states do have LIHEAP funds as part of their weatherization programs. The DOE rules allow leveraging activities to expand weatherization services, and in recent years the DOE funding has been reduced some, so those leverage funds are even more important than they have been before. There is substantial utility involvement in several states, and I'll mention another word about that in a minute or two. The states then give money or contract with the local providers, which are typically nonprofit agencies or local government agencies that actually provide the weatherization services to the low-income people. Again, back to the DOE funding, even though right now DOE funding is not the highest source of funds, that would be the LIHEAP funds at this particular time in our history, that it is the DOE funding that still defines the network. DOE rules are the main rules of the program, the basis for defining the program and the network. And the other sources typically have a little more flexibility, or sometimes not. Sometimes they go exactly by DOE rules. So it works different with different organizations, or different states, I should say. Some stick strictly with DOE rules, some use DOE rules with a few exceptions with their LIHEAP and utility funds. I should mention that not all states have, I said that all states don't have LIHEAP funds. Some states, many states, in fact, don't have utility funds. Maybe, I don't know, maybe half or so do. But those states are probably more concentrated, I'd say, in the Northeast, Upper Midwest, and maybe the West Coast, where the price of energy has been a longer concern, where public benefits programs are more readily accepted. The weatherization network, I mentioned that that the state's contract, or the grantees contract with local agencies. There's a little less than right now 1,000 local agencies reaching every county and local jurisdiction throughout the nation. The vast majority of those local agencies are community action agencies. And those community action agencies have either direct hire crews that do the work, or they contract with home performance type, weatherization type contractors to do the work. I'd say that is split fairly evenly, about half and half, of agencies that use direct hire and agencies that use contractors to do the actual work. A little word about community action agencies. They are nonprofit, private organizations, sometimes public organizations, but they were established under the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 during the War on Poverty to combat poverty. The community action agencies are all recipients of the Community Services Block Grant, which can often make them good partners for the program in that they have other resources and can partner with other organizations and have programs within the organization to help weatherization services. That said, no two community action agencies are really the same. They have different projects, different priorities based on the needs in their own communities. Process for weatherization is basically this. Somebody applies for the program by either hearing about the program through their neighbors or through some kind of outreach, but they apply for the program. There is a process to make sure they are, in fact, qualified for the program, that they have to submit income verification and have that verified by the agency. Once they are approved for the program, they go on a wait list and may be prioritized according to one of those priority classifications I mentioned earlier. When their turn to be weatherized comes around, an audit of the house is done. I write here in the slide audit estimate because the audit entails both a computerized audit to figure out what needs to be done and an estimate of what's going to go on the house as far as the costs go, producing a work order and giving notes to the crew to, on what to look out for, what may be special conditions, things like that. After the estimate and audit is done to define what measures need to be done, then the work is actually done as per the work order. Part of that is that the client is given some energy education and some health and safety education to know what was done on the house, why it was done, and what maintenance tips may need to be done to preserve the measures and to make sure the home is as safe as possible. And they would also, even if measures weren't done in the home, provide some tips like, typically simple energy tips like wash your clothes in cold water when you can, clean the fins on the back of your refrigerator, and change your furnace filters and things like that, lower your thermostat at night. Pretty basic things like that in addition to what was done specifically to the house for weatherization. Then at the end of the process, there is a post-work inspection on the house. Every unit has to be inspected by, preferably and almost always by somebody who did not work on that house before the unit is reported as a completed unit. The inspector will make sure that the correct measures were done, that the measures were installed professionally, neatly, and effectively as per the work order. They'll also ensure that whatever combustion safety and indoor air quality issues there were addressed, and account for the materials that were used to make sure that nothing was charged to the job that should not have been charged to the job. The program has continued to evolve since its inception. In the 1970s, when this program started, jobs were much lower cost. There were similar measures on all jobs. It was sort of a storm window, attic insulation, addressing air sealing on the outside of homes, and pretty basic stuff. The program has evolved both slowly and quickly, if that makes sense. It seems that some of the things take a while to evolve, but some have evolved quickly as well. And if you compare the program to where it is now compared to what it was in the early days, it's pretty unrecognizable if you were able to look at it from the past into the future. Right now, there is a whole house as a system approach, and Kelly's going to talk a lot more about this in a few minutes. There are advanced diagnostic techniques and computerized energy audits that identify the most cost-effective measures. There are more advanced installation techniques, such as a dense pack insulation in sidewalls, which both provides additional R value and stops any air movement in the walls, and mobile home insulation techniques, where for the beginning years of the program, there was really not technology to add insulation to a mobile home ceiling. If you can picture that, there's very little space there, and it's not like an attic where you crawl around and blow insulation, but that's one of the things that has evolved to make mobile home weatherization a lot more cost-effective, being able to insulate the underfloors and ceilings of mobile homes. And there's also been a lot more increased focus on health and safety, because as we got better at weatherizing homes, as we got better at air sealing the homes, there was increased awareness that there was a possibility that there wasn't as much fresh air in the homes because we were sealing them up. So there was this increased focus on health and safety and refining those techniques to ensure the indoor air quality. Some typical weatherization measures include working on the heating systems to make sure they're running as efficiently as possible and as safely as possible. In some cases, the units that are beyond repair or are so inefficient or so unsafe get replaced. We seal ducts and insulate ducts. We are constantly amazed that we see ducts that are disconnected in the house, and there's big gaps in them, a huge energy waste, obviously. We reduce air infiltration to acceptable levels, and by acceptable levels, we have a tool called the blower door that measures that, so we know exactly how far we're getting, and we can reduce their infiltration accordingly. We insulate attics, which has been something that we've always done, and now we probably have better techniques than ever before. I mentioned the dense pack sidewall insulation, which adds both R value, fills the cavity with insulation, increasing the R value, and pretty much making it so there's no air movement within the walls. And then, as the audit prescribes, there's other measures that may be identified and done, including some electric baseload measures. And I also mentioned that we have some more now advanced mobile home techniques, such as insulating the ceilings and the floors of the mobile homes. The savings in weatherization are shown to now average about $250 to $450 per year. That depends on where those houses are and what type of fuel they're using. If they're using something like fuel oil, the savings tend to be a little higher because fuel oil is more expensive. And if they're using a cheaper fuel and natural gas prices have come down in recent years, then the savings might be a little less than they are for fuel oil. There is societal benefits also included in this program, such as reduced hospital visits based on health and safety measures, jobs, supply chain jobs, supply chain business advantages, and things like that that help local communities as well. Mentioned already that there's reduced carbon dioxide emissions and national energy consumption, And I guess I already said that last bullet there about supporting the local economies and small businesses in the supply chain. Weatherization has also evolved, whereas now that technology has become the basis for the entire home performance industry. There are a number, 30-some weatherization training centers that are the leaders in this whole house building science and work in both the weatherization network and outside the weatherization network in this bigger home performance industry, residential energy efficiency, retrofit industry, training those people as well. The home performance industry has teamed with the weatherization program in setting these guidelines for home energy professionals that include work quality specifications, accreditation of training centers, and worker certifications based on some identified job task analyses for each of the identified worker classifications, including energy auditor, quality control inspector, crew supervisor, and weatherization technician or installer. So those things are all evolving into both evolving for the weatherization program and the larger home performance industry outside of the program in tandem with each other. The Recovery Act was a huge plug for the weatherization program. Perhaps some of you who are on the phone were hired during that time, or if you're not in the weatherization program, if you're more in the health-related fields and learning about this program, maybe you've heard more about it during the Recovery Act. But the $5 billion that went into weatherization in the Recovery Act was sort of a one-shot, once-in-a-lifetime type funding that was never really anticipated and much, much higher than ever before. I'd like to state that I feel that we were a huge success in that program, weatherizing almost 800,000 homes with ARA funds, and that being more than 150,000 over the production goals that were set in the state plans that the Department of Energy approved for that grant. It's also a huge increase in the workforce. Weatherization was constantly in the top 8 job producers and lasted longer actually than some that were ahead of it for a while, and was second in the last quarter of, well, I may have that confused, but at some quarter in 2012 it was second in job producers. At our highest, it was over 15,000 new jobs as a result of those Recovery Act funds.
Bob, we currently have 2 questions.
Sure.
The first question, what current or upcoming funding opportunities do you see to allow organizations that are participating in WAP work to add the health components?
Okay, well, that is a complex question because on a federal level, some of the same funding cuts that are hitting weatherization are a challenge for our Healthy Homes partners as well. We are aware, and for the purposes of me being able to rattle this off and to say clearly on the phone what those sources are, I honestly just can't do that now, but we can follow up with the questioner and anyone else who is interested on some sources that we see as possible sources going forward and on how to evolve partnerships. And I'm speaking mainly in terms of weatherization plus health there. I think that was the framework of the question. Is that correct, Raymond?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So I don't have that, you know, in front of me right now, but NASCSP does have that information and can pass it along.
Okay, and then the second question, has there been any focus on environmental education or promotion of the environmental benefits of weatherization?
Yes, and in fact, in our fact sheets, in our past fact sheets, that was always a part of it. We have, in a sense, strayed from that a little bit in the end of the Recovery Act because so much focus was on jobs, and weatherization has multiple benefits, and so much of the stress was on the jobs and the training and getting that a ready workforce, that those environmental benefits, I won't say they went away because they were still happening, but they may not have been focused on as much. With the second term of the president now, and the fact that Hurricane Sandy has devastated so much and climate change is being talked about again, we feel that we will be promoting those environmental benefits, including the reduction on foreign oil, the reduction of carbon emissions, and making homes healthier and safer as well. So yeah, there is some information on that. The national evaluation that was done on a retrospective evaluation in 2000 for homes weatherized in 2008 before the Recovery Act has not been published, but there's also going to be substantial information about those impacts in that evaluation when it is published, which should be soon. So I hope that gave at least some answer to those questions. I'd like to point out some sources of information, particularly the WAPTAC website, www.waptac.org. WAPTAC standing for Weatherization Assistance Program Technical Assistance Center. It is sort of, everything you wanted to know about weatherization. We call it the virtual library and the institutional memory. It has presentation materials, a lot of photographs, a lot of videos. All the DOE rules and regulations are on there. All the DOE program notices are on there. There's a lot on field techniques and training curricula are on there. So it's very in-depth. There's resources. There's contact information. There's information on the training centers in addition to the standardized training curricula. A lot of information on health and safety and what we typically do, information on the public information campaign and promoting the weatherization program and what have you. So if you are not familiar with the site, I urge you to take a look. It is deep and there's a lot of information. That is the home page, and across there you could see the bars there of the weatherization basics, the rules and guidance, technical tools, public information, etc. There is a, under technical tools, figuring that the health and safety component would be of most interest to a lot of people on the phone today or on the webinar today. I have that picture there so you can see under technical tools there is that section on health and safety that has the health and safety guidance and best practices, some frequently asked questions, and the health and safety categories are then broken down into those lettering type things. And if I go to the next slide down, it shows you some of the things listed under A through E. And that's just the start of it, what fit on the one page. So it's pretty in-depth with a lot of information on these topics. And I believe that is my last slide, and we're going to turn things over to Kelly now.
I believe that is the case. So I am just going to pull up my slide. Can you verify that you see the slide, Why Do We Weatherize?
Yes, we have it, Kelly.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I am glad you could all make it. I would ask that I wish I could see you raise your hands or something, but if you could use the chat function in the GoToWebinar control panel, could you just send the the NASCSP webinars organizer. Let them know if you're with WAP or if you're with, I'm assuming there are a lot of healthy homes providers on here, so if you work with a lead program or a mix of stuff, if you could just send those to Raymond, I'd love to get a better idea of the audience, and he'll report back as we're running through. I put the slideshow together assuming that since it's kind of a WAP crash course, that most of you don't have a great deal of experience with the Weatherization Assistance Program. So I'm going to take some time and just go over the house as a system concept that we apply to every home we go in, look at the audit process, just a real quick review of what we do when we go do an audit, overview some of the more typical measures that we do that wouldn't typically be done otherwise, and then something I think will be of interest to a lot of you, I hope, go over some of the rules governing what we can and can't do in the homes, which really is the impetus behind the whole Weatherization Plus Health initiative. So with that, I'll just get started. Bob did a really great job explaining the why and the how and the process and some of the policy behind weatherization. Just to put it in a little more simple terms, why do we weatherize? We weatherize to save energy and money for the client. We improve indoor air quality, to promote the building durability, and to increase comfort. So saving energy. This is from the Buildings Energy Data Book. It's a little outdated, but I don't think the numbers change very much from year to year. And this just shows that 40% of all the energy used in the United States, so that's everything. We're talking transportation, industry, all those paper mills, all those oil wells, all the energy that's used in the whole country, 40% of that is going to power buildings, commercial and residential. Half of that energy is used for space heating and cooling, so just to keep us comfortable when we're at the office and in our home. So that's a lot of energy. And what we found with building diagnostics over the past few decades is that half of that space conditioning energy is wasted. So, whether you believe in climate change or whether you care or don't care about the environment, I happen to care very deeply about it, but I think that's if you're talking with people who don't share those concerns, it really comes down to, why would we want to waste it? Why we don't like to waste stuff anyway, and we're wasting a ton of energy. This is a huge opportunity to save. We improve indoor air quality because we find a lot of things in the homes that we can fix. This, some of you might recognize, this is a little device that is marketed as a way to save energy, and I'm not sure if you can see my pointer. I think you can. You're instructed to install it on the dryer vent so that you can funnel that nice, warm, humid air into the house instead of venting it safely outside. It's for anyone who has dealt with respiratory illnesses or indoor air quality, that's a horrible, horrible idea. All those detergents, and it's just a lot of VOCs, and it's typically someplace kind of confined or in a basement where humidity might already be an issue, and now you're just adding a huge moisture load. So we go in, we see things like this, and we improve the indoor air quality. We also extend building life when we go in these homes, because a lot of times the same conditions that are harmful for indoor air quality are generally going to reduce the building durability. So we address those. What's bad for the occupants is usually bad for the home, and I have it written a little topsy-turvy in that second bullet on the slide, but typically if it's going to cause your building to degrade, it's not very healthy to be around. So it's just something we address in the course of our work. And everything that we do applies to the house as a system principle, where we're looking at all the pieces of a house and how they interact. And you'll notice it's not just the building envelope, which is the walls, the roof, the foundation, and the windows. It's not just the mechanical systems, but also the occupants. They're a huge important part of that house as a system because they operate that house. That's why the client education piece that Bob talked about is so important. So we say house as a system, it can sound like this kind of vague principle, but here's what we mean. If you don't have insulation in the attic, then the heating and cooling system is going to have to work harder to keep that space conditioned. if you have really leaky recessed light fixtures up in your attic, letting all that nice conditioned air escape, then it's going to increase heat loss and gain and can cause ice damming and other durability issues because that nice warm air in the winter floats up through the attic, melts the snow on the roof, and then it freezes again when it gets to the edge. If the bathroom fan, this is really typical what we find out in houses, if the bathroom fan doesn't exhaust all the way to outside, then it's going to dump all that moisture from our nice hot showers into the attic where it's going to condense on the roof. A lot of times we'll go in homes and the homeowner thinks they have a roof leak. Really what they have is a house leak, leaking all that hot, humid air. It condenses on the roof, on the cold roof, and then drips down through the insulation, and they see it. One woman, I think, had her roof re-shingled in this one patch 3 or 4 times before she finally got an energy auditor out there, someone from the local community action agency who was able to identify what was really happening in the house. So that's what we mean by house as a system. We go in, as Bob said, we air seal homes, and then we ventilate. I think I might talk about it a little later, but part of our health and safety regulations require us to apply ASHRAE 62.2, the most modern, most current version of that. It's a residential ventilation standard. And some people say, well, if you're going to add ventilation, you know, why do you seal the air leaks at all if you're just going to come back and poke a hole through the envelope? But it's because what we want is thermal control of the house. And when we leave those leaks, we don't have thermal control. Those blue arrows show cold air leaking in, and then it gets warmed up in the house, and the red arrows are showing that nice conditioned air leaking out of our building. And we don't know where that air coming in is coming from. This one, in this drawing, it's a basement, but it might be a really dirty crawl space, and you know, we just don't want air coming in from those places. So we like to seal it tight and ventilate right, we say. We want to seal our attics because if we don't, that air going up, as I said, it will condense on the roof deck. This is a picture where it's a cold climate and that condensing water has frozen on all the nail heads. Those are the little white dots you see. So you can already see the wood is darkened from that moisture going up there, and eventually it's going to rot the roof out. In my home state of Maine, we have what we call blue tarp roofs all over the place, and it's because of exactly this kind of situation where the house is leaking up into that attic. The insulation is keeping, you know, the attic pretty cold, so when that air leaks up through the insulation and hits the roof deck, it condenses, and the moisture just causes the roof to rot out. And there's always someone who, you know, learned, like most of us who learned construction learned it from someone who learned it from someone who learned it from their dad, and it's been passed on from generations. And so then when we start with these newfangled ideas about building science and house as a system, there are always going to be a few doubters out there who say, you know, we didn't need this stuff before. Why do we need it now? But the fact is that houses are very different now than they were just 40 years ago. A lot of the housing stock we address in weatherization might be older than 40 years, but some of it is pretty new or has been modified over the ages. So we do have to think of it as a really interactive system. Houses are much tighter now. They have more exhaust appliances, that is, you know, dryers that vent outside, bath fans, kitchen fans, anything that's sucking air out of the house. The natural draft combustion appliances have a weaker natural draft, and they basically just have less opportunity to dry out. This is why they're tighter. In the old construction, the construction itself here on the left was just a leakier construction. It was lath and plaster, so you had a lot of gaps. It was board sheathing, board floors, a lot of rubble or stone foundations. Nowadays we have all these great sheet goods and poured concrete footers, and it's just there's not as much opportunity for air to pass in and out, which is great for thermal control, but it makes it even more important to pay attention to the whole house as a system, because that house can be over-tightened. And then we have these big fans. We have, this is, here on the bottom left is more of an old style. It might be a 30 cubic foot per minute of air moving through when that fan is on, versus right above that, one of those new downdraft oven and stove kitchen fans that moves 500 cubic feet per minute. You know, it's just sucking way more air out of the house, which depressurizes it, which can cause to backdrafting, because where we started with open fireplaces, which have a huge pull, you can stand in front of them when they're burning and feel the wind rushing by you, and that's the draft, the power of that hot air safely venting all those combustion byproducts up through the chimney. And then we've increased the efficiency of our heating systems over the years. This is just running through. Now we're up to 80%, 90% efficiency. The more efficient it is, it means the more heat we're pulling out of there, which means the less heat is going up the chimney, which we want. I mean, we want to save the heat, but the cooler those flue gases are, the less kind of a push they have to safely get them up and out of the house. So as those get weaker and our fans in our house get stronger, the fan is kind of fighting against the air going up the chimney, and it can end up sucking those combustion byproducts, all that smoky, sooty, carbon monoxide-laden air back into the house, which nobody wants. Again, just the older construction was a lot leakier, which we don't want, but it also did help it dry out, and now we don't have as much drying potential, so we need to pay attention to the whole house as a system. Our lifestyle changes also make it very important that we look at the house as a system. I know indoor air quality has been tied to health for years and years and years, but we need to also remember that it's been probably the last, I don't know, 40 years maybe, where we've had these huge lifestyle changes. We've gone from a more agrarian society, spending a lot more time outdoors, to a much more sedentary indoor lifestyle in general. Most of us spend over 90% of our time indoors, and most of the clients in weatherization spend a lot of that time in their homes, because a lot of them are elderly, so they're retired, spending that time in the house, or very young children. Those are two of the groups that we prioritize. So they're spending all that time in the house. Indoor air quality is of the utmost importance, and addressing the house as a system helps us take that into account. So I'm going to try this. You'll have to let me know, Bob or Raymond or Cindy, if the speaker doesn't pick it up. I'm going to put my speaker down by the computer. I have a quick video to show you that just pulls together the whole house as a system concept.
This is the story of Grandma's house. Grandma's house works. It isn't a fancy house, and it may not be a comfortable house for Grandma, but as far as building science goes, it works. At Grandma's house, the dry outside air is constantly moving through it, keeping moisture and odors from building up inside. And Grandma keeps a pot of water on the stove just to keep the humidity level up. And Grandma lived many years content in her little house without any problems. But Grandma is getting older, and she is getting tired of hauling all that wood. And right as she is thinking about how a change may be needed, Red comes to visit her Grandma. And as all youngins do, she knows exactly what Grandma needs. Grandma needs insulation. Red makes her case, shows her the brochure, and Grandma calls Big Mike. Big Mike does exactly as he is asked and insulates the attic so Grandma can save money and use less wood. And Grandma is very happy. Until Grandma notices a water stain on the ceiling. Oh dear, Grandma can't catch a break now the roof's leaking. So Grandma calls Big Mike. And Big Mike sees the problem right away. When he added the insulation, now the roof is cooler because the heat is staying in the house. But the bad news is the moisture from inside the house now condenses and freezes on the underside of the roof when it didn't used to. But no worries. Big Mike knows exactly what to do. This house just needs to be air sealed to stop the house moisture from getting up to the attic. aren't solved. One day, Grandma notices something strange. Grandma couldn't see when Brett was coming to visit anymore. Her windows had too much condensation. And now that Grandma's house is so humid, there are little spots on her wall. At first, she didn't notice, but before long, those little spots have turned into big spots all over her walls. And by now, she is calling Big Mike demanding, "What have you done?" Well, Big Mike realizes the mold is growing because the walls are wet from condensation. No problem. We'll warm up the walls by putting in some insulation. And the excess moisture? Now that Grandma's house has been air-sealed and insulated, she doesn't need that pot. But to be extra safe, Big Mike has one more idea for Grandma. We'll add some ventilation to Grandma's house. And Grandma, just to be safe, runs that fan a lot. But poor Grandma, she notices when she runs the fan, something is wrong with her stove. And Grandma learns very quickly, the big fan always wins. So once again, Grandma calls Big Mike. And once again, Big Mike came back. Big Mike realized the error of his ways. With all the insulating and air sealing, we were saving Grandma a lot on her energy costs. But in addition to condensation and mold, now her stove is backdrafting. With that big fan running, the stove doesn't draft properly. There's just not enough air. So Big Mike installs an outside air feed directly to the stove and installs makeup air for the exhaust fan. Grandma and Brad lived happily ever after. And Big Mike, he realized the house has to work as a system, got the necessary training, and repainted the van. The end.
So that is the house as a system in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed that. I love that video. And I hope you could hear it. I'm sorry, I see a chat now that asked if I could make it louder. I was holding my microphone as close as I could. But if you'd like to check it again, this is posted on NASCSP in the curriculum resources, along with a lot of other great resources. But with that, so house as a system, we all have that under our belts now. We all get it. I'm going to quickly run through the audit process that we use when we go to homes. Just really, it's so much more. I think the last I heard, if you're starting from scratch, a 28-day training would be in order to cover all the different skills required. But I am going to do it in under 20 minutes, just to give you an idea of what we do when we're out at the home, so that those of you who work in the healthy homes industry and are looking at collaboration have a better understanding of what we're already doing and where maybe we could work together. So the home visit should always start with a client interview. There is some background work that goes into it beforehand, looking at utility bills, looking at whatever we have on file for the client. But when we get there, the auditor will typically interview the client because, as I said, the residents, the people who live there, are a very vital part of the house as a system. And they can tell us things that we wouldn't necessarily discover. Even with all our diagnostic tools and our really acute observations, we're only there for, maybe 6 hours, typically more like 4 hours doing the audit, whereas they live there year-round. So they can tell us if there are cold rooms, if there are parts of the house that make them a little wheezy, or other kind of signs that something's going on that we might not discover because they might not be happening right in that time window when we're there. And then generally, you'll do an exterior walk-around. So much of the audit is really just looking at everything on, in, and around a house in a way that nobody else really does. People will come, contractors will come and look at certain parts of a house, but nobody really, other than maybe a building inspector, and even them not quite the same way, looks at every aspect of a house like our energy auditors do. You know, they walk around and they make notes of all these different things. I just have some quick, this is just a simple example of some of the things the auditor would note. They'd note what kind of windows they are, whether the chimneys meet code, if there's an attached garage because pollutants stored in the garage or a car started in the garage, well, those pollutants will generally seep over to the rest of the house. If the land slopes to the buildings, that has to do with moisture management. Gutters, same thing, moisture management. Note what kind of roof it is, what kind of siding it is, whether they have storm doors. If they have window below ground, then that might be an indication that you're going to look for moisture problems in the basement. Just really looking at everything and taking it into account. And taking note when you see things like this, all this peeling paint, there might be a really high interior moisture load that's coming out and causing that paint to peel off. So you'll make a note, and when you're in that room in the house, you know, see what's going on there. It's really a lot of detective work, so it's quite fun. They'll make a footprint sketch indicating the what's the conditioned space, shown here as green, versus unconditioned, so not heated, because this is defining the building envelope, or the thermal envelope, we sometimes call it, where around this green box, that's where we want our insulation. That's where we want to air seal, because we don't, if you're looking from the outside, it might look like this shed and the rest of the house are one thing, but you wouldn't insulate a shed, would you? But then you would see this interior wall, and you might think, well, you wouldn't insulate an interior wall. So you have to be really good about figuring out, okay, this is cold and this is hot when we're heating, and we want to add our insulation there. The auditor does all this. I used to have a lot more slides like this, but I just threw this one in as an example of how detailed the auditor gets. They really note everything that's going on in the house, because the more data they grab while they're there, the less likely that they might have to come back, because they're going to enter all this data into an energy audit later. They do visual assessment on the inside, so after the exterior walk around, they go inside and they look around at everything. If there are moisture issues, they want to find out what's causing those. If there's mold, like this picture, I mean, that's a really severe mold problem that we wouldn't really be able to address in weatherization, but even that being the case, the auditor might try to identify what's causing it and help the homeowner come up with solutions that they could then employ to make that home weatherization ready. They look in the walls, find out what kind of, is there insulation, what kind is it, how much, what about up in the attic. This is where some of our most important work takes place at all levels, but especially during the installation. A lot of time is spent in attics. These are some of the things they'll note while they're up there. You know, is the chimney in good shape? Is it safely conveying those exhaust gases out? Is the vent, so the flue, this looks like from a water heater, is it the proper kind for the appliance? They have a pull-down staircase you want to take note, because that's going to affect how you treat the attic. It's a vented attic. It has a gable vent over there, so you want to have that in mind. The ceiling joist cavities, are they full of insulation? Are they not? Is there a floor that you're going to have to pull up and check underneath? Just getting all the information that they can about that house. As I said, just really looking at everything, which doesn't really happen otherwise. A lot of times we run into issues that have nothing to do with energy but would hinder our work, like too much stuff that, you know, we send crews out there to do the work, or contractors. They're out there to do their job, which is generally installing energy efficiency measures. And if you run into stuff like this and the residents are able-bodied and can handle it, then you would ask them to take care of it. If it's, you know, an elderly widow with no family nearby to help, you might try to see if the local church can help, or, you know, if all else fails, then we will find a way to get that stuff out of there. But that's something that needs to be noted by the auditor, because that's going to add some time to the job when the contractors go out there. So after the visual assessment, which is really telling, it gives us a lot of information. Then we get to do, you know, what a lot of us call the fun stuff. We get to pull out our diagnostic equipment and test all kinds of things. One of the biggest areas, I guess, or kind of categories of testing that we do is combustion safety testing. It's critical, you know, if you have fuel leaks, if you have carbon monoxide leaks, they're just deadly. So weatherization has really been on the forefront of developing and implementing combustion safety testing protocols that the home energy performance industry as a whole has been able to adopt. And I think that's a really great thing that this network has done. So you look for fuel leaks. These are some of the different tools that are used based on what kind of appliance you're testing. The smoke tester would be used on oil, boilers, and furnaces like we have in Maine. Combustion analyzer like this is really handy in testing all appliances. You can get combustion efficiency, carbon monoxide readings, all kinds of stuff that I don't even understand. You can check with a thermometer to find out how hot are those flue gases. Are we getting the true efficiency that the heat rise on that air that we're expecting? And then some of our tools are just simple, like this mirror where they'll hold it down and look up the chimney to see if it's blocked or not. Because, again, usually nobody else is looking. You know, if you have your furnace or boiler tuned twice a year, then somebody's hopefully going to be doing this. But a lot of our clients don't do that. I mean, they're having to choose between paying their utility bills and buying books for their kids' school, and they probably don't have a lot of money for regular maintenance. We test gas cook stoves because they're combustion appliances, and a lot of them generate a lot of carbon monoxide. And then we get into the building envelope testing. Bob mentioned this. We look for the air leakage. This is a picture of a blower door if you haven't seen one before. It's basically a tarp that fits into the door really tightly with an adjustable frame. And then this here is a powerful fan that has some hookups, and you hook it up to a manometer which measures pressure differences at really minute levels. It measures it in pascals. That's not important right now. This fan will typically, it depressurizes, depending which way you have the fan running. It'll suck all the air out of the house, and then it can tell by how hard the fan has to work to achieve a certain pressure difference. It can translate that cubic feet per minute of air movement into an equivalent leakage area or approximate leakage area, which is really a really great illustrative educational tool for the client. So that the fan gets this reading, and it comes, we call it CFM 50 because it's the cubic feet per minute flowing at a 50 pascal pressure difference. But point being, we get this number on our manometer, you divide that by 10, and that's roughly the number of square inches of the opening. So it can be really telling, you tell Mrs. Jones that she has 5,000 CFM 50, and that doesn't mean anything. But you tell her, oh, well, it's basically like having a 500 square inch opening, window open, like this one shown here, year-round, winter, summer, rain, snow, sleet, or hail. It's basically like having this huge window just open, letting all that air leak through. So it's really, really good tool. A CFM, a cubic feet per minute, I don't think I said this before, it's about the size of a basketball. So when you hear that number thrown around, just picture that many basketballs full of nice conditioned air flowing in or out of the house. And then we do infrared scans. Those, if you've probably, most of you have seen infrared cameras. You may have seen them in the military. They're really similar to the night vision goggles. We don't typically have the goggles. I've never seen them in weatherization, although I'm sure they'd be very popular. We have these handheld cameras, and they're like a thermal x-ray of the house. So these are both the same photo. The one on the left is with a regular camera. The one on the right is with an infrared camera. And you can see where that attic isn't insulated, or it might, in this case, it might even have fiberglass insulation, but with the blower door running, it's showing where that cold air gets sucked around, which is with the blower door running at the typical pressure difference that we set it at, it's just as if you had a 20-mile-an-hour wind pushing on every side of the home at once. So it's not really that unrealistic, especially in the Northeast, of how the home might behave. And then we test the ducts. Ducts are not talking about mallards, it's a tough word to say, but the duct system, you know, it delivers our conditioned air where we want it, and they're typically operating at some kind of pressure. So if there's a leak in the duct, we're losing pure conditioned air at pressure. It's far more expensive than a leak, say, around a window. Maybe less noticeable comfort-wise when you're sitting by the window, but definitely more noticeable on your energy bills and the overall performance of the house. So we test the ducts to find out how leaky they are. We do a lot of safety testing. Electrical, this is a voltage drop tester where we find a lot of knob and tube wiring, which was innately very safe, but it's been kind of Mickey Moused over the years in most cases. No offense to Mickey Mouse, just saying. It's been kind of added onto here and there, and circuits overloaded. So we test to make sure that if there is knob and tube wiring, that it's still safe before, well, there are different guidelines around that. Just to suffice it to say, we do test it, and we see a lot of dangerous stuff. You know, since we're often the only ones looking at this stuff for years and years and years, sometimes maybe since it was installed, we're the first ones to find these unsafe issues in homes. And you know, knowledge implies action. You see something, you want to do something about it. And then we also look at baseload measures in this program. Baseload is identified as any energy load in the home that isn't seasonal. So not air conditioners, not heaters, but your refrigerator, your water heater, that runs year-round. The lighting is generally 10% of an electric bill, so you can get a lot of savings there. So the auditor goes around and looks at all these different aspects of the home, and then they enter all that data back at the office or sometimes on a tablet out in the field. They enter all of the data that they've collected about the house, all of the diagnostic readings, all the observations, into an energy audit software tool that has been approved by DOE. There are a number of them out there. The free ones developed for the program that are available, you know, free online are called Weatherization Assistant. We call them NEAT, that's the National Energy Audit Tool, and MIA, the Manufactured Housing Energy Audit. There's a multifamily tool being developed right now. They're going to call it MULTI. We love acronyms. And the requirements for an audit to be approved, there are some commercial ones out there too. Some states have developed their own even. And that's it's allowed as long as they meet these requirements, which they have to show the interactions of the different measures, because as I said at the beginning, you know, we look at the whole house as a system, so we know that if we insulate that attic, then that heating system isn't going to be working as hard as it was before. So replacing that heating system, although it still might be a really good idea, it won't save the same amount of energy as if we put it into a house without any attic insulation. So just so it gives us a more, it's supposed to show those interactions, so we're getting a more accurate estimate of the energy savings. It has to be climate specific, obviously. It has to allow for cost inputs because of this last one. It has to list measures in order of decreasing SIR. That's the savings to investment ratio. A term some of you might be more familiar with is return on investment. In the Weatherization Assistance Program, any energy conservation measure that we put in the house, and this doesn't apply to health and safety measures, any energy conservation measure must pay for itself over the life of, over its useful life. So if we add insulation for $2,000, we need to show through our audit, which is using our local climate data and how much it's going to cost to put it in and the data that how the house was operating before. If it costs $3,000 or $2,000, I think I said, to put in, then we estimate things like wall insulation, they'll last, you know, pretty much as long as the walls if it's done well, which we always try to do, so 20 years, say. So it will have to save at least that much over the 20 years. It'll have to save at least $2,000, which in most cases is no problem. So if we, you know, replace a refrigerator, then we have to show this one is using enough less energy that costs X cents per kilowatt hour, less than the refrigerator that was there, that it'll pay for itself over the course of its life. Refrigerators, I think they have like a 12-year life in general, or it might be a little lower in some places. So those are the requirements for the energy audit. So all of that data gets plugged in from the energy detective walking around and testing things at the house, and then we get a nice generated list of these are the measures that you can do in this home that are cost effective, and this is the order you should do them in. So we do have average per house limits on how much we can spend on a house, so we want to start with those highest, the highest savings to investment ratio that we can, so if we run out of money, we don't leave a bunch of, energy savings on the table. So what are those measures? Bob went quickly over. I'll run through this part pretty quick so I have some time to cover what we can't do and why weatherization plus health is so important. I'm going to skip the video, but attic air sealing, as I said, is quite important. Attic insulation, always after we air seal. Obviously, we don't want to be like Big Mike and have to go tear it out. But this is a really great job of, they had air sealed, they prepped it, they put a dam around the chimney, which is required by code to keep any kind of combustibles or other materials a certain distance away from the chimney. They flagged it so the electrician can find where the juncture boxes and other things are if they have to go back up there again. The dense pack sidewall insulation is really effective. This is a quote from Home Energy magazine from years and years ago, but it's still true. It's not unusual to reduce overall house leakage by 30 to 50% by dense packing walls and other closed-in cavities. I bought an old farmhouse and dense packed the walls and cut the air leakage by something like 60%. It was just a huge, huge, huge energy savings, and really cuts down on the fire hazard. So that's kind of a benefit that we do in weatherization that doesn't, I guess, get much play. If you remember in the video where the guy had that hose and he had some pink fiberglass around it to stop the blowback, he was shoving the hose up into the wall. That's what dense packing looks like in action. And these are some of the typical tools. You can see the bales of that cellulose, which is just recycled newspaper with some borates added to keep pests away and as a fire protection. And then different drill bits, misters to if you have to work wet when you're working with lead paint situations, all the safety gear, wall plugs. And this is a prop where we were doing a training and there wasn't enough actual wall space, so they used the prop. But you can see this really is dense. I mean, it's something around 3.5 pounds per cubic foot that the insulation is blown into there. So you can pull away the plastic that's holding this in, and the cellulose will stay up in those wall cavities. That's why it's called dense packing. In basements and crawl spaces, we might come in and see something like this, address the underlying moisture issues that cause the degradation, and leave it like this, where it's a nice vapor barrier. We've added this spray foam, which is insulation and air sealing, up against the crawl space walls, and just clean that up and improve the energy performance of that house. Those are just a few of the measures. We do a lot of others, but I didn't go into those, like heating systems, like Bob said, because those are things that if that heating system breaks, it's going to get replaced eventually, but nobody else is going to go in that crawl space and spray foam those walls. Nobody else is going into that attic except for weatherization or for market rate, then, home performance contractors. So we can do a lot. We can do a lot in this program, but there's always more that we want to do, and that's why I have this. There's a lot that we can't do. For those of you who are new to this, all of our health and safety guidance has been compiled into one WPN, which stands for Weatherization Program Notice 11-6. It's going to be updated this year, so it'll be WPN 13-6. Those first two numbers are the year of publication. And this kind of guidance is the catch-all for health and safety issues, how we can address them, what we can and can't address. So I'm going to run over some, let's see how much time I have, about 15 minutes. I'll try and focus on the ones that I think would be of most interest to this group, and I'll try to leave some time for questions. So these are the broad categories: replacements, asbestos, codes and structure, OSHA, lead-based paint, mold and moisture, radon, ASHRAE 62.2, or I think it might be called ventilation, combustion appliance safety and heating systems, and occupant wellness. I don't think I have all of those in the slideshow. Just quick overview. Replacements, air conditioning and heating systems, if they are red tagged or non-functional, if they can't be made to work as an energy conservation measure, if they aren't working or if they're working in a really dangerous way, we can replace those. It requires a certain type of justification in the state plan, but we can address those. Same thing with water heaters. We can replace water heaters, combustion water heaters, if they're unsafe, or even electric ones. There is that electrical hazard. So unsafe water heaters can be replaced. Other appliances can't be replaced for health and safety issues. Seems counterintuitive because we test the gas stoves, but we can't replace them if we find that they're operating outside of our parameters of safety. But that's only because the standards that apply to gas stoves for carbon monoxide production, they're far above what we consider safe. I think they're at 800 parts per million, and we're more down around 200 parts per million carbon monoxide as a safety limit. So even if we replaced it with a new one, we wouldn't know whether that was within our realm of what we consider safe. So that's why that's there. Refrigerant just applies to safe handling of refrigerant. And window and door replacements are not allowed as health and safety issues. I know it can be a security issue, but if they're that bad, they typically will qualify as an energy conservation measure. If they aren't closing or closable, or if they're broken, then that's a huge hole in the wall, like I showed you that guy crawling through, that air is leaking in and out of, and it should qualify as an energy conservation measure. So we can't do it as health and safety. Asbestos is broken out into the 3 categories that we typically find it in. Asbestos siding, we can remove that and then put it back if we're doing something like dense packing, but we should never, ever, ever drill it or sand it or cut it or anything to make those asbestos fibers friable and in the air. Vermiculite, we see a lot of vermiculite in the older housing stock in some parts of the country. We are allowed to test that because a lot of vermiculite contains asbestos. If we don't test it, we have to just assume asbestos is present and take precautions. We aren't allowed to remove it, but encapsulation is allowed on a case-by-case basis, and we have to follow all the local rules about if a license is needed or whatever kind of other guidelines might be in place. And then on small covered surfaces, we see a lot of asbestos pipe wrap, or some floor tiles or ceiling tiles had it. In these cases where it's or like around furnaces where it's just small bits, encapsulation or removal is allowed, and the state has to determine how they're going to address that, and they'll just write it in their state plan. Codes and structure covers, we go to these homes, and because we're looking at everything so closely, we find a lot of things that we want to fix, but we're an energy efficiency program, so unfortunately there are some things we have to say we just can't take that on, and that's why we need really great partners out there that we can partner with to make these homes weatherization ready. So we can fix certain things, like full-on roof replacement would just tap out our health and safety budget so quickly. You're talking $20,000 a house in some cases if you did have full roof replacement needs, that we wouldn't be able to serve the population that we hope to serve. So we can't do things like that. We can bring things into code compliance when our work triggers it, but we can't expect to go bring the whole entire house up to code compliance. It's just not. It would basically kill the program. Fire hazards, if it's not something we can address, then we have at the very least notify the residents of what we found, and a lot of times probably recommend ways to fix it. And then we deal with electrical issues by, like if we find knob and tube wiring and we determine that it's unsafe, we wouldn't then blow insulation over that. We're very mindful of those hazards. Lead-based paint, we follow the EPA guidelines, the, remodel, renovation, and repair something. I think I got them in the wrong order, but it's the RRP rule about lead safety. But we have our own lead-safe weatherization guidelines, which were actually in place a little bit before EPA came out with theirs, where we address all lead that we find. We don't want to leave that behind for for children to get lead poisoned. And for those of you who haven't seen it in action, I included this slide. This is what it looks like. It's a big deal setting up a job for lead safety, but it's important, and our crews and our contractors do it all over the country every day. Mold and moisture covers, drainage, things that might lead to moisture issues. I don't have much on that. Basically, if we find mold, there are guidelines written into each state's plan about how much mold is too much. If it's more than 6 square feet, then we have to say we can't do anything here. If it's less than that, can we ask them to clean it up, and then we'll address the underlying cause of that mold. Like, we can fix the fact that this bathroom probably doesn't have a bath fan that's vented outside to get rid of all that moisture. We can really go in and fix the problem that caused it in the first place. But they might have to be the ones to clean it up. We can't get into that. I'm not sure the full genesis of that policy, but it does make sense. And we can address drainage, like gutters, downspouts. If a gutter is disconnected and just splashing rainwater right up against the house, we can address that, because we don't want to put energy conservation measures in a home and then let it just deteriorate before our eyes. We don't want to leave people in that situation. Combustion appliance safety and heating. These mainly all have to do with just safety, making sure we aren't letting the appliances backdraft or fill the space with unsafe gases. One thing that doesn't get much play in terms of our impacts on homes is, a lot of home fires where there are fatalities or injuries, they happen in homes without any smoke detector or non-functioning smoke detectors, and we install those. I think it might vary a little bit by state plan, but I have yet to go into a weatherized home and not see where we have installed functioning smoke detectors and carbon monoxide alarms. And that is just an amazing service that we provide out there, and I think it doesn't necessarily get enough play. And then occupant wellness covers a lot of things. We screen the occupants for pre-existing or potential health conditions, because we don't want to go and maybe do some dusty work and exacerbate a respiratory condition that they have, for example. We want to make sure and manage that. I mean, we never go in with the intention to make a mess, but we'll be extra conscious, or even maybe ask the client if they can, go visit a relative or a nearby friend for the day while we're there, so that they don't have any negative effects from that. It addresses all these things: pests, formaldehyde and VOCs, and injury prevention, which is a huge one. We did have to draw the line somewhere. The rule for that is, if it's, like, say it's a staircase, if it's a staircase that our crew or contractor are going to be using to access a part of the house where we're installing measures, then we can fix that. And that's just great, because obviously we aren't going to put up railings and fix the stairs and then take them down before we leave. We're going to leave those there, and the resident is going to benefit. But we can't, we don't have it right now in weatherization anyway, where we can go in and add grab bars and things like that. So that's where we need partners. If we're going to be in the home anyway, it's so much less expensive if a partner organization has as its mission to improve injury prevention in homes. We can go ahead and install that. Our crews are completely capable. It's just not in our rule book. So I thought I'd end with this really adorable slide. These are some of the pests. Most of them are actually far scarier than this. These are the cute kind of pest removal slides, not the scary hornets or or bats that we find up in attics sometimes, or the parrot in one case. Is very bizarre. So in a nutshell, that is the technical side of weatherization. Overview, in case you are looking at partnering with a weatherization provider, you can find all this stuff on WAPTAC that Bob showed in WPN 11-6, or keep your eyes open for the new one, 13-6, which should be coming out this year sometime. I'm thinking towards September. This is a summary of what's in there. It helps lay out what we can and can't do. And from there, you want to look at the state plan of whoever you're potentially partnering with, because they have a lot of leeway. In some cases, we say from the DOE end, they might say, you can do this, but the state can decide what works best for them in managing their budget and their housing stock. So they might say, you know, we could, but we don't want to. Like, we could test for vermiculite, but we're not going to. We're just going to assume there's always asbestos present. But if you're required by 11-6 to do something, then there's not really much wiggle room. You just have to do it. That is it. This is our contact information in case you want to follow up with Bob or I later. And I think, 3 whole minutes for questions. What do you want to do, Raymond?
If people have any questions, they can still use the chat feature to submit them.
Okay.
And right now, we currently don't have any questions. So unless some come in the next couple of minutes, we do want to just take the time to thank our presenters, Bob and Kelly, for joining us today. And we'd also like to thank everyone on the call. Just want to let everyone know that a copy of the PowerPoint as well as a recording will be available on wxplushealth.org in the next few days. So feel free to check back for that. Also, everyone on the line today will be receiving a feedback questionnaire that we would appreciate if you could take some time to fill out, as that will help us with future planning for Weatherization Plus Health. And our webinar series will continue next week with best practices for forming successful collaborations, and you can register for those online at wxplushealth.org as well. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today. And I'm sorry, we do actually have some questions that just came in. Kelly, do you know where we can find an educational packet on wall insulation for clients?
That's a good question. I think that some of the insulation manufacturers have some nice client education materials. That's a really good question. You know, I develop a lot of stuff for trainers and training centers, but not so much client education material. I would start with, I think it's like green fiber is one of them, or I'm trying to remember the stuff I used. Anyone, Bob, do you remember any of the other names of the cellulose insulation?
I would have to research it. Again, perhaps if we know, Raymond, do we know where that question came from? Perhaps we can do a small amount of research and provide an answer.
Yes, we have it.
Yeah.
We can follow up.
Okay. Yeah, we'll find it for you. But in the meantime, if you want to search around, just look for cellulose insulation manufacturers, and they often have a lot of good stuff like that because they want to sell their product too.
And then we have one more question. Can one of you talk about options for landlords of single-family homeowners?
Well, I'll start, Bob. You can fill in if I miss something. So this is where I think I'm understanding. So it's a landlord, but it's not a multifamily. It's like if I owned a house somewhere and I rented it out, so I'm the landlord. What we are looking at, the program is looking at the people who live there. So if the people who live there qualify, then what the landlord would have to do is sign some kind of agreement. What we want to know is that the benefit of the weatherization is going to that low-income client that we're serving. So we wouldn't, go weatherize a house, and then we wouldn't want the homeowner to, kick that renter out or raise their rent or something like that. So if the resident is paying the utility bills, then that's really easy to show because they're going to be the ones benefiting from it, and the landlord would just have to show, usually states like some kind of agreement that says, if we do this for you, then you can't raise the rent or, push these people out for reasons other than if they're just, I don't know, misbehaving in some awful way for a certain amount of time. So you have to keep it at this rate for a certain amount of time. Is that about it, Bob?
I would just add a little clarification. One, the resident, the renter, is the weatherization applicant. So that is the person who has to qualify for the program. And as Kelly said, the landlord does have to agree to some things, including letting the home be weatherized, but also agree that the benefits are supposed to go to the resident. several states and local agencies have landlord financial participation agreements where they ask the landlord to contribute towards the weatherization of the house. I know in some they have some things that they think the landlord for sure ought to provide, like a safe heating system, for instance. So if there is health and safety work that needs to be done on the heating system, they might want the landlord to pay for it or to pay a certain percentage of the, of the overall weatherization work. That's not done in all states. It is done in some. And that's my 2 cents adding to that, what Kelly said.
Okay, and one last question before we go. If a state radon program supplies radon test kits free or reduced cost, other than testing, what else can be done for collaboration between WAP and state radon programs?
That's a great question. You know, the national evaluation that Bob mentioned, it has this whole indoor environmental quality study that is, it's like, I don't want to say in limbo because it is coming out, but it's kind of, they're parsing the data and still figuring out what exactly it means from the study, and the radon piece of it is huge. You know, what are the impacts of weatherizing? What are the instances of radon above the approved 4 picocuries per liter level, and what can we really do about it? There's some, well, I haven't actually been able to find the reports and check them out myself, but that's more a function of my own busyness than them not being there. I've heard that there are some data out there showing that really well sealed, like vapor barriers in crawl spaces and basements, properly sealed with overlapping seams and sealed against the walls and stuff, can have a positive effect on radon in homes. So by positive, I mean it makes the radon go down. But all that stuff is still kind of questionable. And you know, other than providing tests, I guess what a radon program might be able to do is, if there are situations where the tests come back and they're really high, and we could work together, like if the radon program had money to pay for a radon mitigation, if they were able to work with the cruiser contractors, a lot of the skill sets that are used in our typical energy conservation measures work really well. You know, they're typical general like construction stuff. It's applied in these really specialized ways, but if there was money in that radon program to help, well, not help, they'd have to pretty much pay for the radon mitigation system, maybe working with the weatherization providers would be a way to deliver that radon mitigation system, if you get what I mean. Otherwise, yeah, Bob, do you have anything to add, or Janae, if you're still on the phone?
No, I really don't. I think, as you said, some of our typical measures for preventing moisture in a crawl space may give some relief to radon, such as the ground vapor barrier you were talking about. But you know, there are some restrictions on what DOE weatherization dollars can do. We're all waiting for the indoor air quality study to be released to see, you know, what evidence there is one way or the other about the effect of weatherization in regards to this. So.
Yeah, and once that comes out, maybe we could even have a call about that. One thing that did occur to me while you were talking that I'd like to add, and this will be interesting. So I've heard rumors that the data showed that in homes where, because this was a retroactive study, I'm forgetting the word right now, because this was looking back at 2008, before we had implemented the ASHRAE 62.2 ventilation standard across the board, we got to see the difference between having ASHRAE 62.2 in place and not having ASHRAE 62.2 in place. And I've heard rumors that in homes where ASHRAE 62.2 was fully implemented, so we met their ventilation requirement, that radon was reduced. So it's not saying that it was above the level and it dropped below, but whatever it was before, that's the rumor I heard. We'll have to wait till the study comes out to find out for sure. But if that is true, I think it would be really interesting for state radon programs to consider working with the weatherization providers, either doing maybe a little more testing and study to find out if that really is the case, or if the numbers are really convincing. We can pay for ASHRAE 62.2, but it's really a strain on our health and safety budget. So if the radon program, it wouldn't have to take on the full cost of ASHRAE 62.2, but could chip in, then they would be touching and having a positive impact on these households without having to bear the full brunt, and they would be really helping the weatherization program reach more people because their health and safety budget wouldn't be so tapped out on that one measure. So that's something that might be interesting to look back at when we get the study in our hands.
Thanks, Kelly. So it looks like that's all the time we have for now. If you had a question that was not addressed, we will be following up with you in a separate email. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you all have a good afternoon. Thanks.